Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, first of all, for the most lovely introduction. I feel a bit nervous because nobody could live up to that lovely introduction, but I'll do my best to it. So thank you, Donald, and thank you, Carlos. This is the most wonderful PS to one of the, excuse me, one of the most wonderful meetings I went to, which is in the Excel Center in the summer at the huge international meeting. I was completely gobsmacked, I have to say, by what I heard, what I saw, and by the extraordinary congregation of people who had different expertise, all meeting around the hand. It was an extraordinary experience for me. So I feel very privileged to be invited to talk to again to the British Society for the Surgery of the Hand. I'm rather astonished also as I see the numbers coming that there's almost 100 people there. So thank you very much indeed from various places, seemingly all over the planet. The story I'm going to tell is perhaps a bit of a just so story, but at least I hope it does justice to the importance of the organ that all of you, or the structure that all of you are involved in repairing, restoring, and replacing. I believe that the hand had a central role in our becoming so different, even from our nearest primate kin. Hence the story, how we got to be so different, the hand and human evolution. I have had an acquaintance of the hand way back when. The first paper I ever published was Neurophysiological Studies of Autogenous Sural Nerve Grafts, way back in 1978. So at least I've got a little bit of a toehold, or indeed fingerhold, on the science of the hand. But I've always been interested in what makes us different from other animals. And it seems to me that the hand has had a major role in making us so different, even from our nearest primate kin. And this is a story that I spelled out at rather excessive length, I guess, in a book called The Hand, published in 2003. I hardly need to tell you this, that the hand is amazingly multi-purpose. It is, of course, primarily an organ of manipulation, but it's also an organ of cognition. It's the chief organ of the fifth sense. And it's an organ in which manipulation and cognition are combined in prehension, making, as it were, tactile sense of the world. And something that Donald is particularly interested in, it is an organ of communication. The versatile hand is a professor of grasping, seizing, pulling, plucking, picking, pinching, pressing, patting, poking, prodding, fumbling, squeezing, crushing, throttling, punching, rubbing, scratching, groping, stroking, caressing, fingering, drumming, clapping, shaping, lifting, washing, flicking, catching, writing, typing, even this slide, and so on. All of that you know, but it is extraordinarily versatile. And I want to argue that it is the primary agent of our agency. It is, as Aristotle described it, the tool of tools. And my central argument is that it promoted the passage from beast to man, and it has a central role in the shaping of humanity. I sort of unpacked the story that was told in The Hand a little bit more in a couple of other volumes in a trilogy about first-person being. What is it like to be a self? And I feel The Hand has had a role in giving us a sense of selfhood and agency, and I'll touch on that later on. And then out of that, we became an animal that is uniquely a knowing animal. This character is our nearest animal kin. You'll recognize him or her. Daisy, let me just press the knob there. Nice. And at this stage, I declare an interest. I'm a humanist. And humanists, it seems to me, try to avoid supernatural accounts of humanity, of how we became so different. We avoid the notion that God made us different, that on a particular day, we were made in the image of God, quite unlike other bits of matter, other organisms. So as a humanist, I avoid a supernatural account of humanity. But also I've got to acknowledge we are rather strange, we're rather peculiar. And I need to avoid a naturalistic account of humanity that claims that we're not fundamentally different. And there's an awful lot of that about. We are, as human beings, of course, a biological organism. we grow in the uterus, we live by biochemical and other means, and we perish of largely biological causes. But more than that, we're self-conscious agents, and we're even self-conscious moral agents. We have a sense of ought. There's a lovely essay by Hazlitt, who once said that man is the only creature who laughs, because he's the only creature who understands the difference between how things are and how they ought to be. So we have a sense of ought as well as what is. And more than that, we are combined together in a community of mind. The difference between us and other beasts or other creatures can be summarized very simply, that whereas they live out an organic existence, we actively live or actively lead narrated lives. Of course, there are many who claim that we're just animals. It's a very popular notion, particularly among people who think by asserting that notion, they're being faithful to Darwin, and I'll come to that in due course. But of course, the very claim that we're just animals is itself a highly developed expression of something unique to human culture. You wouldn't hear apes saying we are just animals. St. Augustine famously said, "Inter feces et urinam nascimur." We are born amid feces and urine, and just sort of cut us down to size and say we're just like other beasts. But as you know, unlike other beasts, we actually comment on this fact, and we do so in Latin, which I understand few other beasts are capable of mastering. I want to look at our contrast with our nearest primate kin in another way. The greatest technological achievement of large primates 5 million years ago was to use a stone to break a nut. Spoiler alert. What's the greatest technological achievement of large non-human primates today? Oh dear, to use a stone to break a nut. What about us? The greatest technological achievement of human beings 300 years ago was a steam engine. The greatest technological achievement today, nuclear power, the internet, and talking to a friend in Australia without raising one's voice. There's something absolutely profound in the difference between the evolution of our technological achievements as opposed to the non-evolution of the technological achievements of non-human primates. So we're a unique species. We're fundamentally different from other beasts. So the question is, how did we get to be so different? Now, the challenge for someone who wants to answer that is to accept Darwinism. Darwinism explains the origin of the organism, Homo sapiens, but to do so without succumbing to Darwinitis. Darwinitis reduces persons to organisms. So to arrive at, as it were, to respect Darwinism without succumbing to Darwinitis, we have to find a way of understanding how biology made possible our partial but progressive liberation from biology. The way we fill our days is utterly different from the way that even our nearest primate kin fill their days. So how did we get to be so different? Is there a biological explanation of how the process started by which we became so different? And the central thesis of this talk is that the hand had a central role in the journey from animality to humanity. And thus I will offer you a just so story that began about 5 million years ago. I can't be precise, I wasn't there at the time despite my appearance of antiquity, but that's where the story roughly began. An essential step was bipedalism, standing up on two legs. Why did that happen? Well, there's various accounts of this, but one account is that 4 to 8 million years ago, there was a climate change in Africa where most hominids were concentrated. Suddenly there were cooler, drier conditions. There was a loss of tree cover. And that prompted a journey from the jungle to the plains. And that triggered an assumption of the upright position. A bit awkward being upright in the jungle, less awkward and indeed more beneficial being upright in the savanna, in the plains. Now, one of the benefits of the upright position is that vision acquired a much greater and more special status. Vision, of course, is synoptic. When I look around, I see a whole visual field. When I touch, I don't have a whole tactile field. And there's an explicit distance from the perceiver, me, and that which I perceive. And that lies at the heart of our anticipation of the future. When I see something coming towards me, I see the future. When I touch something, that which I touch is here now. And philosophers say that vision is the most epistemic of the senses. It's the sense that is closest to knowledge. The other advantage of upright position is the speed of movement. You can go quicker on 2 legs than on 4. And of course, we can be more successful predators. And more importantly, perhaps in the earliest phase, we were more successfully in escaping from predators. But there was another important consequence of the upright position. Some of you may recognize this character, the absolute genius, Charles Sherrington, who talked about the liberation of the hand resulting from the upright position. Bipedality, he said, liberated the hand, quote, from being a locomotive prop to a delicate explorer of space. The functions of the liberated hand could be summarized, as I've done already: manipulation, exploration, and communication. So one of the keys to our differences from our nearest primate kin is the domination of vision among the senses, the head as a watchtower resulting from the upright position, the fact we could speed up, the liberation of the hand by the upright position, but also something else that happened round about that time, which is the acquisition of special properties by the human hand. These properties include something with which you're much more familiar than I am: the development of full opposability, stunning versatility and manipulation. I'm going to talk about that. What I've called constrained manipulative indeterminacy, self-addressing of the hand, the emergence of the hand as a proto-tool, and a result of that, the infection of the body with the sense that one is both a self and an agent. So I've touched already upon the assumption of the upright position liberating the hand. But what about the development of full opposability? The special properties of the higher primate hand have been well described. The entire hand can flex at the wrist. Fingers flex at the carpophalangeal joints. There's flexion at the interphalangeal joints. There's movement of the finger, especially thumb and index fingers, permitting cooperation of those fingers. But in human beings, one of the key elements is full opposability. That's made possible by a unique combination of the saddle joint and the appropriate relative length of the thumb and index finger. Consequence was a uniquely high opposability index, apart from, quite different from the incomplete opposability of the primate hand or the non-human primate hand, is the total opposability, in particular, of the index finger and the thumb. And the other important thing is the independence of the index finger, which will become very important when we think about communication, particularly pointing. The reasons of the superior opposability are better known to you than to me. Muscles at the base of the thumb are especially well developed, but also there is rich innervation of the fingertips. So when the fingers touch each other, when they are opposed, much more information passes between them than would do in other circumstances. So there we have the perfect opposition between thumb and index finger. And actually, this picture is taken from John Napier's beautiful book on the hand, which I suspect many of you will be familiar with. If you look at the gorilla, opposability is limited. So we have the development of full opposability. And one of the consequences of that is stunning versatility in manipulation. There are power grips, of course. Again, I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs at this stage, but an object may be held in a clamp formed by the partly flexed fingers and the palm, counter pressure being applied by the thumb, lying more or less in the plane of the palm. Thus, it's defined by John Napier in his lovely book. An object may be pinched between the flexor aspects of the finger and the opposing thumbs. So we have power grips and position grips. There is a polydactylic bravura expressed by the human hand. And these are some of the examples. Again, you'll be more familiar with them than I am. A 5-jawed chuck, useful for turning knobs on a machine. A 3-jawed chuck for holding a pen. A 2-jawed chuck, side to side, for threading a needle. A 2-jawed chuck, pad to side, for turning a key in a door. All of these things we can do differentially, electively, voluntarily. That's what our hand is capable of and what it makes us capable of. And here's things that you don't need to be spelled out, the different ways in which the hand may function. Pinch grip, precision grips, and so on. Of course, it's interesting, we may use successively a pinch grip and a precision grip, I beg your pardon. Let me just check back, in the same situation. So we have a precision grip when we pick up the bulb, but a slightly stronger grip when we're trying to twist it off its base. So we have versatility and manipulation. That versatility isn't just a question of random movements. It's constrained, what I've called constrained manipulative indeterminacy. So we have a limitless range of ways of using our hands, but we exercise manual choice. We have bespoke grips customized to the needs of the moment. And in the 2 or 3 years it took me to write the handbook, I was terribly aware of how many new grips that I was, as it were, creating during that time, just in everyday life. We have an extraordinary voluntary capacity to manipulate our own hands, constrained manipulative indeterminacy. But the point about it is it's constrained. It's constrained by need. It's not random movements. And in addition, there's something I've called manual self-addressing. Let me just focus on that. Look at this perfect opposition between the thumb and the index finger. This is a situation in which the hand addresses itself. This is tactile self-awareness, reflective awareness of the hand. And it can, of course, be within a hand, or it can be one hand addressing another. But that kind of awareness then spreads more broadly into our sense of our hands being tools that we ourselves use. The hand is a proto-tool. The hand is the primordial tool. What's more, as a primordial tool, it's an inspiration for tools in the conventional sense. Animals do use tools, but human tool use is so different because animal quasi-tool use is not rooted in the sense of bodily agency, of the body as a proto-tool, a sense that's resulting from the infection arising from the hand as a proto-tool. So human real tool use is rooted in this sense. We can think of primitive tools. The earliest tool probably was the pebble chopper. And the interesting thing about the pebble chopper, which came into sort of use 2.5 million years ago or so, is that it had two parts. It had a part which you gripped and a part that did the business. And you can see this pebble chopper, it's being held by the hand. That's the quasi handle, as you were. And you can see then there's the part that does the business, the chopping and so on and so forth. This is even more obvious in the case of a hand axe, where you grip the top and you use it, use the distal part to do the business. Incidentally, the gap between the pebble chopper and the hand axe was probably 1.5 million years. As it were, the development of tools was initially a very, very slow business. The important thing about human tool use, as opposed to supposed tool use in other animals, is that it is, as it were, informed with the very concept of a tool. And that's obvious in the case of where a handle is, as it were, separated from the business end of a tool. It's even more obvious in complex and composite tools, and more obvious yet in secondary tools, tools used to make tools. And then we see something that I referred to earlier on, which is the development of tools. Yes, chimpanzees may use a pebble to smash a nut, but there's no development. There's no sense of a tool, of its possibilities, of its causal interaction with the world. And certainly nothing that would lead ultimately to mobile phones, nuclear power stations, and so on. And of course, we then have what are called by philosophers autonomous tools, that is, machines that get on with the business even in our absence. And there is no ceiling to a human tool use. Part of that is because we have shared experiences within our groups, shared experience to a much greater extent than is seen in other animals, even primates. Crucial to shared experience is language, and I'm going to come to that in due course. The shared experience across groups, the shared experience over history, and the hand had a hand in this. I'll come back to that in due course. And as a result of the hand as a proto-tool, we have a sense of our own bodies as agents, as selves. This body as mine, this body as my primary agent, the primary agent of my agency, and the sense that I am doing this. And that full-blown sense of agency and of first-person being, of me that's doing this, doesn't appear to be clearly apparent, even our nearest primate kin. We always talk about grasping things. Oh, I know what you say. I think I've grasped what you thought, and so on and so forth. And it's no coincidence that there is this overlap between what you might call cognitive grasping and literal manual grasping. Very words, prehension, apprehension, comprehension, show the link between the body and the mind through the grasping hand, making sense of the world around it. The central thesis that I'm trying to offer you is that the hand had a central role in turning animal consciousness upon itself and becoming human consciousness. The hand is a root of uniquely human selfhood. The hand is a root of uniquely human agency. And it's also at the root of hierarchies within our own bodies, a subject-object relationship, a patient-agent relationship we have in relation to our body. Let me give you an example. An important asymmetry when we touch ourselves. Look at this individual touching her shoulder with her hand. It's obvious in this context that the hand is the, as it were, the agent, the shoulder she's touching is the patient. That is to say, the shoulder is an object and the hand is, if you like, the agent of her subjectivity. And that asymmetry is very central to our sense of our using our own bodies in a very deliberate way. So we can see the hand has a role in the emergence of the self in the body. There's manual, tactile self-awareness, what I've talked about, fingers touching fingers, hands touching hands, hands touching the rest of the body. Creating the notion of a hand as a tool, and those two together giving a subject-object divide within our body, and highlighting our sense of ourselves, our bodies as ourselves, or ourselves as embodied subjects. This is the first intuition beyond the threshold that's reached by non-human primates, that I am this body, and that also I'm an agent. I do these events. This didn't happen suddenly. Getting to be so different occurred gradually, slowly. It begins near a certain threshold. After all, primates are very close to having quite complex consciousness of each other and self-consciousness. It just doesn't get over that threshold where it starts being elaborated as it is in human beings. They're close to the sense of the self as an agent. But this progress towards the kind of complex selves, ourselves as agents, me planning this talk, you kindly inviting me, all of those things. It took a long way to get to that point. It was a gradual process, millions of years, but speeding up. So I've touched on some of the functions of the liberated hand: manipulation, exploration, and then of course there's something that feeds back into the processes that I've talked about, which is communication. A hand as a communicator. We have a sense of our hand as a primordial tool. We have a sense of another as a conscious agent with whom things can be shared. We therefore use our hands. And one of the ways we use our hands to share our experience is, of course, pointing. Needless to say, I've written a book on pointing because it is such an extraordinary manual gesture. One of the most poignant things that we see when children grow up is they start pointing things out to us. I mean, people talk about mansplaining, but baby-splaining is just as potent. Babies pointing things out to us. And their pointing is quite different from the sort of hints of pointing seen in other species. Pointing is a human universal, but it is quite different from pointing even seen in chimpanzees in captivity. Chimpanzees in the wild don't point. Sometimes they point in captivity, but this is called imperative pointing. It's about gimme. It's basically an abbreviated grasp. But for human beings, pointing is important. It's about sharing experiences. It is what the linguists would call declarative pointing, and this is unique to human beings. You take a baby down the road in the pram, it's always pointing things out to you because it wants to share them with you. So the hand is a very important weaver of the fabric of our collective consciousness. The talking hand has been discussed by many writers, including people who are interested in how actors use their hands. But Runeberg, a Scandinavian, I've forgotten, I think he was Norwegian, talked about the pantomimic expression of the hand. By them we can desire, promise, summon, reject, threaten, pray, plead, refuse, ask, admire, display shyness, doubt, indignation, flattery, agreement, delight, empathy, wrath, desperation, admiration. There is a huge amount of semantic, a great semantic load can be delivered by our hands. He adds pleasure and malicious delight, clap their hands. Desperation wrings them, reverence folds them. So there are countless gestures of the human hand. And it's been argued by some, like Bickerstaff and so on, that gestures lie at the origin of language. And of course, gestures are particularly potent because of the primacy of vision among the senses. I can see what your hand's doing. You can see what my hand is doing. I can see that your hand is pointing. And I can also then look along the axis of your pointing to see what it is you're pointing at. And when we think of building up the community of minds that is our humanity, it is the product of 1 trillion cognitive handshakes. Gestures, especially pointing, are absolutely central to this. Well, that's some of the ideas that are I've mobilized in developing a Just So story of how we got to be so different from other primates and the central role of the hand in making us different. I don't for a moment think this is an original idea, and in fact, it is probably the most unoriginal idea you've heard. It was first put forward by a Greek philosopher called Anaxagoras. It is because he has hands that man is the most intelligent among the animals. It was Aristotle, whom I've quoted already, described the hand as the tool of tools. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, said the hand is the window onto the soul. And as we were talking about Darwin, what about visiting his granddad, Erasmus Darwin, who wrote a long poem about the hand? Nerved with fine touch above the bestial throngs, the hand, first gift of heaven, to man belongs. Untipped with claws, the circling fingers close, with rival points the bending thumbs oppose. Trace the clear lines of form with sense refined, and clear ideas charm the thinking mind, whence the first organs of touch impart ideal figures, source of every art. Not great poetry, but good sentiment. Some of you may be familiar with this figure, the great anatomist Frederick Wood Jones. And he said that man's place in nature is largely writ upon the hand. Now, some people may say, well, hang on a moment. There are other ways of explaining our difference. What about brain size? Well, I have to tell you, changes in brain size are not very impressive over the period in which we have evolved most rapidly. And after all, a brain's not much of a thing if it isn't wired up to a body. Others have suggested that language is the primary driver of our difference from non-human primates. But actually, it's a bit of a parvenu. It's a recent development. Some think language goes back to 40,000 years. Some think that language goes back 100,000 years. But the kind of changes that I'm talking about began 5 million years ago, as I've argued. And language itself, as Bickerstaff and others have indicated, may be the child of the hand. The brain isn't entirely irrelevant, of course. As a neuroscientist, I wouldn't say that. Of course, complex manual activity drives the development of the brain. And we know that the representation of the hand in the brain is changed according to what you do with your hands. For example, violinists may have a greater representation of their right hands, which have to regulate the movement of the bow than they do of their left hand, which merely holds the instrument and does a few little twiddlings on the strings. And of course, there's another way around, that the development of the brain permits more complex manual activity. There is an iterative process. Manual activity drives brain development makes for more complex manual activity, an iterative process. So just to sort of wind up, steps towards us. I've argued that the special properties of the liberated hand are central. The hand, as liberated, became, as it were, a proto-tool. There was an instrumentalization of the body, an enhancement of agency and awareness of it by tools, and then the collectivization of solitary sentience into an explicit, mutual awareness in a shared social space, of which, of course, pointing had a central role. We had shared visual attention, shared mediated visual attention by pointing, shared mediated visual attention using other signs, paraverbal signs and artifacts. There's shared non-visual attention through language, and ultimately, we have woven the fabric of the collective world in which we have extraordinary, complex, rich lives. I've sort of moved over quite quickly the passage from consciousness, such as is seen in our primate kin, to the complex self-consciousness that characterizes ourselves. Nor have I talked about the stabilization of self-consciousness to an enduring sense of self. Nor have I argued for the validity of the sense of agency. I have a sense that I do things, but am I really free? Well, these are all the topics for another talk. And by the way, we are free. It's my last book, proving or demonstrating my own satisfaction that we have genuine freedom. I want to end with a quote from an anthropologist, Tim Ingold. Attention in Western thought, who spoke of attention in Western thought between the thesis of man's absolute separation from and domination over the world of nature, including animals, and the contrary thesis that all living forms, including humans, can be arranged in a single continuum or change of being. And I would like to say that yes, we are animals. Yes, our origins are understood biologically, but we found a biological, or there was found for us, a biological means by which we escaped to some extent from biology. we became those extraordinary creatures of whom Schelling said, nature opens its eyes and notices that it exists. So I want to end by flagging up or embracing Darwinism, but resisting Darwinitis. Our biological roots don't encompass our cultural leaves. We are explicit animals partially uncoupled from nature. We engage with nature on rather different terms. The limits of our possibility are not prescribed by nature. In the hand, we have a pointer to the biological processes by which we escape from biology. And for that reason, I have to say, thumbs up for the hand, and especially for those surgeons who look after it. Thank you for your attention, and especially at this time of night for the courtesy of simulating it. Thank you very much.